You kind of mentioned this already. You said, believe it or not, there's actually some similarities between investigating the eyewitnesses and in your profession, and then also investigating the historical narratives as eyewitness accounts as well. Can you kind of describe what are those crossovers, or what tools do
Right.
you use in investigating eyewitnesses as in your profession, and how do they cross over into investigating the New Testament?
Right. So I have cases that my cold cases are all events in the past. I don't have any living eyewitnesses usually. Well, I don't have any. There were never eyewitnesses to begin with who could identify a suspect who saw the thing happening. That's why it's cold.
Right.
We have lots of cases with eyewitnesses, they get solved. But the ones that we don't get solved are there for a reason. And so I don't have those kinds of cases. I don't have cases with a living eyewitness. I don't have cases in which I have good forensic evidence. I can't solve them with DNA, can't solve them with fingerprints. Those aren't the kinds of cases I work. So I have to do them a different way. And it's basically by assessing all the other circumstantial little bits and pieces that assemble together in a cumulative case. Well, that's very similar to working the Gospels because you don't have any access to the witnesses. You don't have any forensic evidence you can use. You have this event in the past, and you've got to do your best to assemble a circumstantial case cumulatively to decide if something is true. And a lot of this is going to come down to really assessing what are the records you have. So it's not unusual for me to have a report from 1972. Somebody says they saw a car parked out in front of the location prior to the crime. Well, guess what? That witness is now dead. And the person who interviewed that witness is probably also dead or really old. So I'm going to have to make a decision about whether this claim is true without access to the report writer and without access to the person he's writing about. And that's very much what we do with the Gospels. You're not going to have access to the writers. You may not even know much about the writers. And you're not going to have access to what they're writing about. You can't, if they describe someone in the Gospels, you can't go interview that person. So you don't have any forensic evidence. You're not going to make this case with DNA or fingerprints. It's all going to come down to the same approach. Part of it is going to be us assessing whether or not that report is reliable. And we do this with every eyewitness the same way. Is there's four criteria. Was the person who said he saw something, was he really there? Because people will say stuff and they weren't even there.
Right.
And so you have to figure that out. Two, can you corroborate his claims, even though the corroboration is probably not going to be as much as you might like? So all corroboration is touch point. So if you said, hey, I saw this dude go in the bank and he leaned over the counter and he stuck a gun in that lady's face and he yelled at her. Okay, great. I go back, I go to the counter, I dust it for prints. I find there's a palm print that matches the suspect that you described, right? The same guy we're talking about. And sure enough, it's right where you said he leaned on the counter. So that corroborates his
Corroboration.
statement.
Yeah.
But that little palm print will not tell you if he carried a gun.
Right.
That was one of the claims. It won't tell you what he said. That was one of the claims. In other words, corroboration always gives you a small fraction
Gotcha.
of what the overall statement is. And we look at that and we say, that's okay. I mean, I think I've done this in front of juries, and they're very quick to say, oh, yeah, I think he's been corroborated, even though the thing that corroborates him is very small
Mm-hmm.
percentage of what his claim is. So I'm looking for that kind of corroboration. I call that touch point corroboration. It just touches on the key points of the testimony. It won't cover all of it. Third, has he changed his story? Has he been honest and accurate consistently over time, or has that been kind of wobbly? And then fourth, does he have a bias that would cause him to lie? So those are the four criteria, and we have those in our jury instructions. So we don't just pick a jury. We pick a jury, and then we instruct them. Because a jury that doesn't understand how evidence comes together and what rules of evidence are is not going to help you. You have to
Right.
have a jury that at least knows enough about the rules of evidence and I talk about this in a book called Forensic Faith, and you have to kind of get people ready to hear the case. We don't just throw it on them without any way of processing and thinking rationally about evidence. So we have jury instructions, and that's the criteria we use in the jury instructions. So those four areas are what I focused on as I went through the
Yeah.
Gospels and tried to determine if they were reliable. So
Just to take one of those, because it's kind of a common accusation made against the Bible is the bias one.
okay.
So why were the New Testament writers or the Gospel writers not biased?
Well, I wouldn't. I wouldn't just outright just say they're not
Okay.
biased. I mean, I think we have to test that. First of all, the fact that they have an opinion or they have a belief system in place is not necessarily a bias that would cause them to lie. So every juror we put in panel, we ask them. We know they all have beliefs. They all have opinions. They all have personal histories, and they're not clean slates when they sit in
Right.
that jury box. And we ask them about that during voir dire. We'll ask a series of questions before we'll impanel a jury, but we know in the end we're going to ask them, are you willing to suspend whatever bias you have in order to, because we know they have them,
Right.
are to do this fairly. And like for example, if you hate guys with beards because you had a bad problem with one of your neighbors who had a beard. Well, now my suspect's got a beard, my defendant. So are you going to be able to step across this, or is this beard going to be an issue for you?
Yeah.
And then they'll say, oh no, I can handle that, no problem. Well, then we got to figure out, is he telling us the truth? And then the defense attorney will decide if he's going to put that guy on the jury. So we always have something we have to overcome. But I do know this: in the end, bias comes down to what motivates you to do something you shouldn't do. If that's make a decision you shouldn't make, or if that is for you to lie. So if we're saying that the writers of any historical account are biased, what we're really talking about is, are they motivated to say something they shouldn't say, something that isn't true, to do something they shouldn't do? And all of that motive comes down to three. There are only three overarching motives for any misbehavior. Only three. And you learn these working cases. These are also in the Bible, but I didn't have a Bible when I first started working as a detective, but I could see the motives behind any crime, behind the same things behind a murder. They're the same things behind a theft. They're the same things behind a lie, that behind any sin anyone has ever committed. There's only three things that drive them, and that is financial greed, sexual lust, and the pursuit of power. Those are the only three motives for any misbehavior. And when people say, oh, I can think of a fourth, you're wrong. There's not
It could
four.
be reduced.
There's just three.
Yeah.
I had someone email me today and say, well, what about somebody who just wants prestige? Well, that's power. It's a subset of power. That pursuit of power is nuanced, and it can include a lot of subsets, right? So if you've been disrespected and you shoot somebody because they disrespected you, this happens a lot in gang violence I've worked over the years. But what's that? That's pursuit of power. That's like my authority and respect has been challenged. Fame, seeking fame, prestige. These are all nuanced issues related to power. So they all fall. Well, how about vengeance? Well, what are you vengeful about? What are you feeling vengeful about? Well, that's one of those three things. Yeah. Well, what about jealousy? Well, what are you feeling jealous about? It's going to be one of those three things. It always comes back to. Now, you might see a fourth category is crazy, but if you're criminally insane and we find you to be criminally insane, we're not going to prosecute you. I'm talking about those motives that are prosecutable. Now, I'll tell you this: such a small percentage of people are ever determined to be criminally insane. It's an unbelievably small percentage. I mean, people do crazy things all the time. Does not mean they're crazy. People who are not crazy are capable of doing crazy things, and judges get that. And very few are ever deemed criminally insane. Instead, they're tried, even though they might be, killing people and eating their bodies afterward. That sounds crazy. Well, no, those people, they're going to be tried.
Right.
And so, in the end, it's going to come down to one of those three things that drives bad behavior. And so that's what helps us, because then we can say, well, are these authors biased? Well, does Joseph Smith, and when writing the Book of Mormon, possess any of those motives? Yeah, he possesses all three. He was paid by he became supported by the church. He consistently borrowed money from his congregants. He even established a bank on the basis of his followers' money. There was a financial motive. Doesn't mean that he's lying. It just means that he had the motive to lie.
Right.
Not only that, he wrote scripture that allowed him to be wedded to over 30 women that he consummated their relationship with, some of whom were married to other people. So it also satisfied the second motive. And third, he at one point he announced as running for presidency. He had the largest standing army on the North American continent other than the American Army. And this is a guy who had power and position and had sexual motives and had financial motives. Now, again, it doesn't mean he's lying, but he certainly had some motive to lie. Now, if we're going to ask this question of the authorities related Christian scripture, we got to ask, well, what is driving them?
Yeah.
If they're doing something they shouldn't do, this is a lie. They're driven by one of these three things. Which is it? Are they getting rich? Are they getting girlfriends? Or are they getting a position of power? Now, you might argue that these folks, well, I think that the position of power you get that just leads you into constantly being beaten and persecuted and ultimately martyred is a kind of a crazy thing to think about. Right. And especially if you think about who wrote the most of any of these alleged people who are after power, money, or sex, and I think it might be power. I think Bart Ehrman would probably argue that that's what's driving the authors more than anything else, is this power, this authority they're gaining in a local religious community. But Paul's the best example of that. I think he wrote the most scripture in the New Testament. Do we really think what's driving him? You think he's driven by power? I mean, he had a position of authority and respect before he started this whole mess. I think, if anything, I think he's jumping out of that position as a Jew of the highest order, most devout, a great prodigy of one of the best teaching rabbis of that generation, who then decides he's got the authority at this time to draw papers to have Christians persecuted, but no, he decides to jump out of that position of authority and power and respect and jump in with the Christians, where he's just going to suffer for 20 years and get his rear end kicked all over the known world, hoping to someday return to what he started with. That's the claim, really. One of the things we talk about a lot is the difference between what's possible and what's reasonable. And in jury trials, possible doesn't count. It's called speculating when you say, well, what if, we're not allowed to do that kind of speculating in jury deliberation. You have to stay with what has been presented to you evidentially, because I can imagine or cast some possible or imaginary doubt about anything. Mm-hmm. Those don't matter. It's reasonable doubt. That's the standard we're after, because you can never get beyond possible doubt for any claim, any claim about anything. And so therefore we could never prosecute anybody. So here, is it possible that these folks were after some kind of fame? Or sure, I always say yes if you ask me if something is possible. Yeah. I just don't think it's reasonable. Yeah. And that's why I try to make reasonable decisions, not just possible speculations.
That makes a lot of sense.
Thanks so much for watching our video. If it was helpful and useful to you, I'd really appreciate it if you would follow us, subscribe to our channel at the bottom link here in the video, and tell your friends. And please follow us on social media.